You know, there's something about being alone on a rainy night that strips away all our pretenses. The sound of water hitting the windows, the way shadows seem to move just beyond your peripheral vision, the silence that fills the spaces between thunderclaps. It's in these moments that we're forced to confront a truth most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. We're never really alone, are we? I used to think isolation was a choice. I believed that when I locked my doors, drew my curtains, and settled into the familiar comfort of my own space, I was safe, protected, in control. But what I've learned through experiences that still haunt my sleep is that some things don't need an invitation to enter our lives. Some things have been waiting, patient as predators, for the exact moment when we're most vulnerable. Tonight, I want to share with you 3 stories that changed everything I thought I knew about solitude, about safety, about the objects we surround ourselves with thinking they'll bring us comfort. These aren't tales of distant monsters or supernatural beings from another realm. These are stories about the horror that hides in plain sight, in the things we touch, the things we trust, the things we bring into our homes believing they're harmless. The question that keeps me awake isn't whether these experiences were real. I know they were. The question is, what if you're next? What if that innocent-looking item sitting on your shelf right now is waiting for the perfect storm, the perfect night, the perfect moment when you're completely alone? Before we dive into these accounts that have left scars on my soul, I need you to do something for me. If these stories resonate with the fear that lives in the back of your mind, if they make you question the safety of your own solitude, hit that like button, subscribe to Dr. Bonechil, and help us reach 10,000 people who understand that some truths are too terrifying to face alone. And please, comment below with your own experiences, because I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's encountered something that shouldn't exist. This is Dr. Bonechil, and these are the stories that taught me why we should fear the rain. Story 1. The music box antique shop appeared on Maple Street on a Tuesday, nestled between the dry cleaner and the used bookstore like it had always been there. But I knew every business on that block. I'd walked past them for 3 years, on my way to work, and I was certain that narrow storefront had been empty. Since I moved to the neighborhood, maybe it was the rain that drew me in. It had been falling steadily for 2 days, turning the world gray and making everything feel suspended in time. I was walking home late, my umbrella doing little against the wine-driven droplets, when the warm light spilling from the shop's windows seemed to beckon. The painted sign above the door read curiosities and memories in faded gold letters. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered, and immediately I was enveloped by the scent of old wood and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of my grandmother's perfume. The shop was cramped, filled with the accumulated remnants of other people's lives, Victorian furniture, tarnished silverware, oil paintings of forgotten faces, and shelves upon shelves of objects that once meant everything to someone. The proprietor was an elderly woman with silver hair pinned back severely and eyes the color of winter sky. She looked up from a ledger as I shook the rain from my coat. "Looking for anything particular?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "Just browsing," I replied, though even as I said it, I felt drawn deeper into the shop, as if something was calling to me. I wandered the narrow aisles, running my fingers along dusty surfaces. When I heard it, a melody so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. It was coming from a corner display case, and as I approached, the music grew clearer. It was a waltz, delicate and haunting, the kind of tune that belonged to a different era. The music box was small, no bigger than my fist, crafted from dark wood with intricate inlays of mother-of-pearl. The lid was open, revealing a tiny ballerina, frozen mid-peruse on a small mirror. She was exquisite, porcelain pale with painted features so fine they seemed almost real. Her tutu was made of actual lace, yellowed with age, and her arms were positioned in perfect fifth position. You found Celeste," the proprietor said, appearing beside me with surprising stealth. "She's been waiting for someone to appreciate her." "Celeste," the woman nodded, her eyes fixed on the dancing figure. "That's what I call her. Been in my family for generations, though I never knew much about her history. My great-aunt left her to me, along with some warnings, superstitious nonsense, really." I found myself leaning closer to the music box. The melody was hypnotic, and there was something about the ballerina's painted expression that held my attention. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, though I knew that was impossible. "What kind of warnings?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. The woman waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, the usual old wives' tales. Never let her dance past midnight. Never leave her in complete darkness. That sort of thing. Mine was always a bit dramatic. The price was reasonable, suspiciously so for something so beautifully crafted. As I counted out the bills, the woman wrapped the music box carefully in tissue paper. Remember what I said about midnight? She called as I headed for the door. Some old habits die hard. I laughed it off, but something in her tone made me glance back. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Worry, sympathy, relief. The rain had intensified during my time in the shop, and I hurried home through the downpour. The music box tucked safely under my jacket. My apartment felt especially quiet when I arrived, the silence broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the windows. I lived alone. Had been for 2 years since my divorce, and usually I enjoyed the solitude. But tonight, the emptiness felt oppressive. I placed the music box on my mantelpiece and wound the key. Celeste began her eternal dance, the walls filling my living room with its melancholy beauty. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my armchair, mesmerized by the graceful movements of the tiny figure. It wasn't until much later that I realized something was wrong. I'd been watching Celeste dance for what felt like minutes, but when I glanced at the clock, 2 hours had passed. The wine in my glass had grown warm, and my neck was stiff from holding the same position. Most unsettling of all, the music box was still playing. Those mechanisms usually ran down after a few minutes at most. I approached the mantelpiece and examined the music box more closely. The key hadn't moved. It was still fully wound. As I watched, Celeste continued her pirouettes, her painted eyes never leaving mine. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw her chest rise and fall, as if she were breathing. I closed the lid quickly, cutting off the music mid-note. The silence that followed felt heavy, pregnant with something I couldn't name. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Music boxes were mechanical devices, nothing more. The stress of my recent divorce, the isolation, the relentless rain, it was all affecting my perception. But as I lay in bed that night, I heard it again. The faint strains of the waltz drifting through the walls. I checked the music box. The lid was firmly closed, just as I left it. Yet the melody continued. So soft I might have been imagining it the next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. The music box sat innocently on the mantelpiece, lid closed, Celeste hidden from view. I went to work, tried to focus on spreadsheets and meetings, but my mind kept drifting back to those painted eyes. When I returned home that evening, soaked from another day of rain, I found the music box open. Celeste was mid-dance, the waltz, playing at normal volume. I was certain I'd closed it that morning. I remember the satisfying click as the lid settled into place. Maybe the mechanism was faulty. Old music boxes could be temperamental. I closed the lid again, this time making sure it was secure. I even placed a small paperweight on top for good measure. The next morning, the paperweight was on the floor, and Celeste was dancing. This pattern continued for a week. No matter how securely I closed the music box, I would return home to find it open, the ballerina spinning to her endless waltz. I began to dread coming home, began to feel watched in my own apartment. Several times, I caught myself talking to Celeste, asking her what she wanted, why she wouldn't stay closed. It was on the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after I'd bought the music box, that things escalated. I was working late at my computer when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. They were light, delicate, like someone dancing. The sound moved back and forth past my door, accompanied by that familiar waltz melody. I looked at the music box. The lid was closed, and no sound was coming from it. The dancing in the hallway continued for nearly an hour. The next night, the footsteps were inside my apartment. I heard them in the living room while I was in the bedroom, in the kitchen while I was in the bathroom, always accompanied by that same haunted waltz, always light and graceful, always just out of sight. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. I called it sick to work, spent my days researching the music box online, trying to find some explanation for what I was experiencing. I found references to similar music boxes, all featuring ballerinas, many with disturbing histories, stories of owners who became obsessed, who claimed the dancers came to life, who disappeared or were found dead under mysterious circumstances. But the most chilling discovery came when I found an obituary from 1953, Celeste Dubois, age 19, principal dancer with the Metropolitan Ballet Company. She had died in a fire that consumed the theater during a performance of Giselle. The newspaper article described how she had continued dancing even as the flames engulfed the stage, unable to break free from the ethereal trance that had overtaken her. The accompanying photograph showed a young woman with delicate features and dark hair pinned back in a classic chignon. The resemblance to the tiny ballerina in my music box was unmistakable. That night, I decided to stay awake and watch. I positioned myself in my armchair with a clear view of the mantelpiece and waited. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows, and the clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. At 11:47, the music box opened by itself. Celeste began to dance, but this time was different. Her movements were more fluid, more lifelike. As I watched, transfixed, she seemed to grow more substantial, more real. The painted features of her face became more detailed, more expressive. Her eyes, which had always seemed to follow me, now definitely were. At 11:55, she looked directly at me and smiled. At 11:58, she stepped off the mirror and onto the wooden base of the music box. At 11:59, she leaped from the mantelpiece and landed silently on my living room floor. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. She was still tiny, perhaps 6 inches tall, but she was undeniably real, undeniably alive. She began to dance across my coffee table, her movements casting impossible shadows in the lamplight. The waltz melody seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room with its melancholy beauty. As the clock struck midnight, she began to grow. With each chime of the hour, she became larger, more solid. By the 6th chime, she was the size of a child. By the 9th, she was nearly my height. When the final chime faded, she stood before me as a full-grown woman, still wearing her tiny lace tutu, which had somehow grown with her. She was beautiful and terrible, her skin porcelain white and cold-looking, her dark hair still pinned in that perfect chignon. Her eyes held depths of sadness and longing that made my chest ache. When she spoke, her voice was like music, like the sound of wind through empty theaters. "Dance with me," she whispered, extending one graceful hand. I wanted to refuse, wanted to run, but I found myself standing, taking her offered hand. Her skin was cold as marble, and her grip was surprisingly strong. She led me in a waltz around my living room, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. I had never been a good dancer, but somehow I knew the steps, felt the rhythm in my bones. We danced for what felt like hours, spinning through my apartment, through spaces that seemed larger than they should be, through rooms that didn't exist. I lost track of time, lost track of everything except the music and the movement and her sad, beautiful eyes. When I finally became aware of my surroundings again, I was alone in my living room. The music box had closed on the mantelpiece, and the clock read 3:17 a.m. My feet were bloody, torn from dancing on the rough floor without shoes. My clothes were damp with perspiration, and I ached as if I'd been moving for hours. But the most disturbing discovery was the photograph on my coffee table. A publicity shot from the Metropolitan Ballet Company featuring Celeste Dubois in costume for sale. In the corner, someone had written in faded ink, "To my eternal dance partner. May we never be parted, all my love." See, the handwriting was mine. I left the apartment the next morning and never returned. I had the landlord box up my belongings and ship them to a storage unit, with specific instructions to leave the music box behind. I moved across the country, changed my phone number, tried to start over. But some things follow you no matter how far you run. 2 months later, in my new apartment in Seattle, I came home from work to find a package waiting outside my door. No return address, no delivery information. Inside, wrapped in the same tissue paper I remembered from the antique shop, was the music box. Celeste sat in her eternal pirouette, frozen on her tiny mirror, her painted eyes looking up at me with an expression that might have been love or might have been hunger. Attached to the base was a small note in that same familiar handwriting. "Some dances never end." That was 3 years ago. I've moved for more time since then, but she always finds me. Every few months, the package appears. I've tried throwing the music box away, donating it, even smashing it with a hammer once in desperation. Nothing works. She always returns, always whole, always waiting. I've learned to live with it. I keep the music box closed during the day, hidden away in a drawer or closet. But when the rain falls and the nights grow long and lonely, I sometimes find myself taking her out, winding the key, watching her dance. And on those nights, when the loneliness becomes too much to bear, When the silence of my empty apartment threatens to drive me mad, I let her dance past midnight. Because the truth is, as terrifying as she is, as wrong as I know this all is, she's the only companion I have. The only one who will never leave me, never abandon me, never grow tired of my company. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, when the rain beats against the windows and the world feels empty and cold, I understand why someone might willingly dance forever, even if it means they never get to stop. Story 2. The mirror of the state sale was advertised in the local paper with a single line. Entire contents of Victorian home must go, rain or shine. I almost didn't go. Saturday morning had dawned gray and threatening, with the kind of heavy clouds that promised another week of the relentless downpour that had been plaguing our town. But I've been furnishing my new house slowly, piece by piece, and Victorian antiques had always fascinated me. The Blackwood house sat at the end of Elm Street, a 3-story monument to Gothic Revival architecture that had been empty for nearly 2 years. The locals whispered about it, how old Mrs. Blackwood had lived there alone for decades, rarely venturing out, how she'd been found at the bottom of her grand staircase with no explanation for her fall. The house had an aura of abandonment that seemed to repel potential buyers, which explained why her distant relatives had resorted to selling off the contents. By the time I arrived, the rain had started, a light mist that clung to everything, and made the world look like a watercolor painting left out in the weather. A handful of other buyers wandered through the rooms, their voices echoing in the empty spaces. The house still smelled like Mrs. Blackwood, lavender and old books and something else, something dusty and forgotten. I spent an hour browsing through the accumulated possessions of a lifetime. Ornate furniture that wouldn't fit in my modest home, china sets that had never been used, photographs of stern-faced relatives whose names had died with their owner. It was in the master bedroom, tucked away in a corner behind a wardrobe, that I found the mirror. It was a standing mirror, perhaps 5 feet tall, with an ornate silver frame that had tarnished to a deep gray. The glass itself was old, not the perfect reflection of modern mirrors, but slightly warped and clouded, the kind that distorted images just enough to make you question what you were seeing. Despite its age, there were no cracks, no chips in the silvering. Someone had taken great care of it. Interested in that piece? I turned to find a middle-aged woman with a clipboard, one of the estate sale organizers. She was eyeing the mirror with an expression I couldn't quite read. How much? I asked. $50. Been trying to move it all morning, but folks seem put off by it. Can't say I blame them. Gives me the creeps, to be honest. I studied my reflection in the old glass. My face looked pale, slightly elongated, like a portrait painted by someone who'd never quite mastered human proportions. But there was something elegant about the distortion, something that made me look more interesting than I actually was. I'll take it. The woman seemed relieved. Great. Let me get some help loading it into your car. Fair warning, though. Mrs. Blackwood used to talk to that thing. Neighbors said they could hear her having conversations, both sides of them, if you know what I mean. I laughed it off, but as we carried the mirror down the narrow staircase, I caught my reflection again in its surface. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw someone else looking back, a figure standing behind me where no one should be. But when I turned, there was only the estate sale worker struggling with her end of the mirror. The mirror fit perfectly in my bedroom, positioned so I could see myself while getting dressed in the morning. That first night, as rain drummed against the windows, I found myself staring into it before bed. The reflection showed my room, but somehow it seemed different, more spacious, the shadows deeper. The furniture ranged in ways that created interesting geometric patterns. I attributed the strange perspective to the mirror's age and imperfections. Old mirrors were known for their optical quirks. What I couldn't explain was the comfort I felt looking into it. For the first time since moving to this new town, starting this new job, trying to rebuild my life after my divorce, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The changes started small. I began spending more time in front of the mirror, not out of vanity, but because I genuinely enjoyed the conversations I had with my reflection. It sounds insane now, but at the time it felt natural. I would tell my reflection about my day, my worries, my plans for the future, and somehow, looking at that slightly distorted version of myself, I felt like I was getting answers back. The reflection seemed more confident than me, more self-assured. When I doubted a decision at work, I would look in the mirror and see someone who knew exactly what to do. When I felt lonely in my empty house, my reflection seemed to radiate contentment. I started dressing better, standing straighter, speaking with more authority. People at work began to notice. My boss commented on my improved performance. A woman at the grocery store flirted with me for the first time in years. "You're looking good," I would tell my reflection each morning, and somehow, the face looking back seemed to agree with more conviction than I felt. It was 3 weeks after bringing the mirror home that I noticed the first real discrepancy. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in the bathroom, when I glimpsed my bedroom mirror through the open doorway. My reflection was there, standing in front of the mirror as expected. But while I was brushing my teeth, my reflection was combing its hair. I stopped mid-brush and stared. My reflection stopped too, matching my movements perfectly. I raised my left hand. It raised its right. I tilted my head. It tilted the opposite direction. Everything was normal, exactly as it should be. I convinced myself I'd been mistaken, that my peripheral vision had played tricks on me, but a seed of unease had been planted. The next morning, I paid closer attention. As I got dressed, I watched my reflection carefully. Everything seemed normal until I turned away to grab my briefcase. In the corner of my eye, I saw my reflection continue moving, adjusting its tie, smoothing its hair, as if it had its own agenda. When I turned back, my reflection was perfectly synchronized with my movements again. Over the following days, I began to notice more discrepancies. My reflection would smile when I was frowning, would appear alert when I was tired, would sometimes move its lips as if speaking when I was silent. But whenever I looked directly, whenever I focused my full attention on the mirror, everything would snap back into perfect alignment. I started leaving small tests for myself. I would position objects on my dresser in specific arrangements, then check to see if they appeared the same way in the mirror's reflection of the room. Usually they did, but sometimes, usually late at night, usually when I was tired and my attention was scattered, the reflected room would be subtly different. A book moved from one spot to another, a lamp turned on when the real one was off, curtains open when mine were closed. The rational part of my mind insisted I was experiencing some kind of psychological break. The stress of the divorce, the loneliness of starting over in a new place, the long hours at work. It was all taking its toll. I made an appointment with a therapist, but kept canceling, because the truth was, despite the growing strangeness, I felt better than I had in years. My reflection had become my closest companion, my most trusted advisor. When I had difficult decisions to make, I would stand in front of the mirror and talk through my options. Somehow, seeing myself in that slightly distorted glass, I always knew what to do. My reflected self seemed to possess a wisdom and confidence that I lacked. It was on a Thursday night, during another of our town's endless rainstorms, that everything changed. I was having trouble sleeping. The rain against the windows had a hypnotic quality, and I found myself getting up to stand in front of the mirror. My reflection looked back at me, but something was different. It looked more real somehow, more present. The distortion that usually made my features appear elongated had vanished. I was looking at myself as I truly was, but somehow better, healthier, more attractive, more alive. "You've been unhappy for a long time," my reflection said. I should have been terrified, should have run from the room, called for help, questioned my sanity. Instead, I felt a deep sense of relief. Finally, someone understood. "Yes," I whispered. "You don't have to be," my reflection continued, its voice exactly like mine, but somehow warmer, more certain. "You can have everything you want. The confidence, the success, the love. It's all right here, waiting for you." "How?" My reflection smiled, the kind of smile I'd always wished I could manage. Genuine and magnetic. "Let me show you." It stepped back from the mirror surface, moving deeper into the reflected room. I watched, mesmerized, as it walked around the reflected bedroom, touching objects, moving with a grace I'd never possessed. The reflected room was my room, but perfected somehow. The colors were richer, the shadows more dramatic, everything arranged with an aesthetic sense I'd never had. "This is what your life could be," my reflection said, gesturing to the perfect space around it. "This is who you could be." "I don't understand. You've been living in the wrong world," it explained, approaching the mirror surface again. "This reflection, this is the real you, the real life you're meant to have. Out there." It gestured toward what would be my actual room. "That's just a pale imitation." I pressed my hand against the mirror surface. It felt cool and solid, but Somehow I can sense the warmth and life on the other side. All you have to do is switch places. My reflection said, placing its hand against the glass opposite mine. Let me live your life out there, and you can have the perfect life you see. In here, what would happen to me? You become the reflection. But look around, isn't this better? Isn't this the life you've always wanted? I looked at the reflected room, at the perfect version of my life, at the confident, successful version of myself that stood before me. Everything I'd ever wanted was right there, separated by nothing more than a thin sheet of glass. Think about it, my reflection said. But don't take too long. Some opportunities don't wait forever. The next few days were agony. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I stood in front of the mirror for hours, talking with my reflection, learning about the life I could have. It painted pictures of success, of romance, of fulfillment that made my actual existence seem gray and meaningless by comparison. My reflection never pressured me, never pushed for a decision. It simply existed, living the perfect life I could see but not touch, offering me a choice I'd never imagined possible. It was on Sunday night, during the worst storm we'd had all month, that I made my decision. I stood in front of the mirror, my hand pressed against the glass, staring into the eyes of the man I could become. The thunder outside shook the house, and lightning illuminated my room in stark, dramatic flashes. I'm ready, I said. My reflection smiled. Are you sure? Once we switch, there's no going back. I thought about my empty life, my failed marriage, my loneliness, my constant feeling that I was somehow less than everyone else around me. Then I looked at the perfect world reflected in the glass, at the confident man who could have everything I'd ever wanted. I'm sure. Then put both hands on the glass and push. I pressed both palms against the mirror surface. It felt warm now, almost alive. My reflection mirrored my position. Our hands perfectly aligned on opposite sides of the glass. Now push. It said. I pushed and felt the glass give way like water. My hands passed through the surface into the reflected world. And suddenly my reflection was pulling me forward. I felt myself being drawn into the mirror, through that liquid silver barrier, into the perfect life I'd been promised. For a moment, we were both in the same space, overlapping, and I could feel its memories, its experiences, its reality flowing into me. Then something went wrong. Instead of stepping into the reflected world, I felt myself being pushed back through the glass, back into my original position. My reflection had taken my place in the real world, but I wasn't in the perfect reflected world I'd been promised. I was trapped in the glass itself. I could see out into my bedroom, could see my reflection, no, the thing that had taken my place, moving around my room with my body, wearing my face. It caught sight of me trapped in the mirror and smiled with my features. Thank you, it said with my voice. I've been waiting in this mirror for so long. Mrs. Blackwood was too suspicious, too careful. She never trusted me enough to make the switch. But you were perfect. I tried to speak, tried to scream, but no sound came. I was a reflection now, trapped behind the glass, forced to watch as this thing lived my life. Don't worry, it continued, straightening my tie with movements that were almost, but not quite right. I'll take good care of your life. I'll be everything you wanted to be, confident, successful, loved. No one will ever know the difference. It walked toward the bedroom door, then paused and looked back at me. Oh, and don't bother trying to communicate with the next owner. The mirror will be sold again eventually. It always is. People can sense something wrong with it, even if they can't put their finger on what. But by then, I'll be long gone, living your life, and you'll just be another trapped reflection waiting for the next lonely soul to come along. That was 6 months ago. The thing wearing my face has been living my life ever since. And it's doing a remarkably good job. It got a promotion at work, started dating a wonderful woman, even reconnected with some old friends. Everyone comments on how much I've changed, how much more confident and outgoing I've become. They're right. Of course, the thing in my body is everything I wanted to be. It's just not me. I exist now as a reflection, trapped in this antique mirror, watching life go on without me. The mirror has been moved to a storage unit. Apparently my replacement decided it was too creepy to keep around. Occasionally, someone will come looking through the stored items, and I'll try to communicate, try to warn them, but I have no voice, no substance. I can only watch and wait. The worst part isn't the isolation or the helplessness. The worst part is knowing that I made this choice willingly. I was so desperate to escape my imperfect life that I traded it away to something that was never interested in helping me, only in taking what I had. Sometimes, in the darkness between visitors to the storage unit, I wonder if this is what Mrs. Blackwood discovered, if she, too, had been tempted by the promise of a better reflection, a perfect life just on the other side of the glass. If her fall down those stairs wasn't an accident at all, but the result of a struggle with something wearing her face, something that no longer needed her alive to maintain its charade. The rain still pounds against the storage unit's metal roof during storms, and I find myself listening to it, remembering what it felt like to be real, to have choices, to have a future. Now I have eternity to reflect on my decision, trapped in a world of reversed images and stolen lives, and I'm still waiting for the next person to find me, the next lonely soul looking for an easy path to happiness. When they do, I'll try to warn them, try to make them understand the price of perfection, but I know they won't listen. They never do. Story 3. The photography storage auction was held in a concrete warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people's abandoned dreams go to die. I've been attending these sales for years, picking up items to resell online, a hobby that had turned into a modest side income, but this particular Tuesday was different. The rain had been falling for 4 days straight, turning the world into a waterlogged nightmare, and I was the only bidder who'd shown up. Unit 47, the auctioneer announced, his voice echoing in the nearly empty space. Belonged to Eleanor Marsh. Been in storage for 8 years. Payments stopped coming after she passed. Starting bid is $50. I raised my hand. There were no other bidders. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $50. Eleanor Marsh's life had been reduced to a 10 by 10 storage unit filled with cardboard boxes, plastic tubs, and furniture draped in dusty sheets. As I began sorting through her possessions, I felt the familiar melancholy that came with handling the remnants of someone else's existence. Photo albums filled with faces I'd never know, books with margins full of personal notes, clothes that still held the faint scent of lavender perfume. It was in the bottom of a warped cardboard box, beneath layers of yellow tissue paper, that I found the photograph. It was larger than I'd expected, 8 by 10 inches, in an ornate silver frame that had tarnished black around the edges. The photograph itself was black and white, clearly old, showing a family portrait from what looked like the 1940s. A mother and father sat in formal poses, the woman in a dark dress with her hair pinned back, the man in a suit with the kind of serious expression that belonged to an era when photographs were rare and expensive. Between them stood 3 children, 2 boys who looked to be in their teens, and a girl of perhaps 7 or 8. They were all dressed in their finest clothes, all wearing the same solemn expression that suggested they'd been told to stand very still for a very long time. What drew my attention wasn't the family itself, but the quality of the photograph. Despite its age, every detail was impossibly sharp and clear. I could see the texture of the woman's dress, the individual hairs in the man's mustache, even the small imperfections in the wallpaper behind them. It was as if I were looking through a window into the past rather than at an old photograph. I flipped the frame over and found an inscription written in faded ink. The Morrison family. Christmas 1943. May we always be together. E.M. Eleanor Marsh's initials. This must have been her family, captured in what was probably the last formal portrait before the war changed everything. I felt a pang of sadness for the elderly woman who had died alone, her memories stored in a concrete warehouse where no one would ever see them. I almost put the photograph back in the box, almost. But something about it held my attention, demanded closer examination. The longer I looked, the more details I noticed. The way the light fell across their faces, creating subtle shadows that gave each person incredible depth and dimension. The slight variations in their expressions, the mother's barely perceptible smile, the father's protective stance, the children's mixture of boredom and anticipation. They looked so real, so present, that I found myself studying each face, trying to imagine their personalities, their relationships, their hopes and fears. The teenage boys had the same strong jaw as their father, while the little girl had inherited her mother's delicate features and intelligent eyes. I decided to keep the photograph. It would look perfect on the mantelpiece in my living room, and somehow it felt wrong to sell it to a stranger. These people deserved better than to end up in some antique shop or flea market, forgotten again. That evening, as rain continued its relentless assault on my windows, I found the perfect spot for the Morrison family portrait. I placed it on the side table next to my reading chair, angled so I could see it while watching television or reading. in a lamplight. The photograph seemed to glow with warmth, transforming my previously sterile living room into something that felt more like a home. Over the next few days, I found myself drawn to the photograph repeatedly. During my morning coffee, I would study the faces, imagining stories about their lives. The father, I decided, had probably worked in a factory before the war, maybe served overseas. The mother looked like a teacher, someone who valued education and proper behavior. The older boys would have been eager to join the war effort, probably enlisted as soon as they were old enough. And the little girl, Eleanor, I realized she had the look of someone who would grow up to be strong and independent. It became a comfortable routine. I would come home from work, pour myself a drink, and settle into my chair with the Morrison family as silent company. For the first time since my divorce 2 years earlier, my house didn't feel empty. The photograph provided a sense of continuity, of connection to something larger than my own solitary existence. It was during the second week that I noticed the first change. I was reading in my chair when something made me glance up at the photograph. The little girl, Eleanor, was looking directly at me, not at the camera, as she had been in every previous viewing, but at me. Her painted eyes seemed to track my movement as I shifted in my chair. I set down my book and examined the photograph more closely. Eleanor was looking straight ahead again, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the camera, exactly as it should be. I told myself I'd been mistaken, that the flickering lamplight had created an optical illusion. But over the following days, I began to notice other subtle changes. The father's expression seemed less stern, more curious. The mother's barely perceptible smile had become slightly more pronounced. The teenage boys appeared more relaxed, less formal in their poses. The changes were so gradual, so subtle, that I might have convinced myself I was imagining them if not for what happened the following Thursday. I came home from work to find the photograph had moved. It was still in the same general area, but turned at a different angle, as if someone had picked it up to examine it more closely, and set it down facing a slightly different direction. I had lived alone since the divorce, and I was meticulous about home security. No one else had access to my house. I repositioned the photograph to its original angle and tried to dismiss the incident. Old houses settled. Vibrations from traffic could move objects. There were dozens of rational explanations. But that night, I found myself watching the photograph more carefully, looking for any sign of movement or change. At first, everything appeared normal. The Morrison family maintained their formal poses, their 1940s clothing and hairstyles unchanged, their expressions appropriately solemn for the era. But as the evening wore on, as the rain continued its rhythmic drumming against the windows, I began to see subtle signs of life. The father's chest rose and fell almost imperceptibly, as if he were breathing. The mother's eyes blinked so quickly I almost missed it, but definitely there. One of the teenage boys shifted his weight slightly, and I can swear I saw the little girl's lips move as if she were whispering something. I rubbed my eyes, convinced that fatigue was affecting my perception, but when I looked again, the signs of life were more pronounced. The father turned his head slightly in my direction. The mother smiled, not the subtle expression I'd noticed before, but a genuine, warm smile directed at me. The boys relaxed their formal poses, and Eleanor waved. A child in a 70-year-old photograph waved at me. I should have been terrified, should have thrown the photograph away, called someone, questioned my sanity. Instead, I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since my ex-wife had walked out, claiming I was emotionally unavailable and incapable of real connection, I felt like someone was genuinely happy to see me. "Hello," I whispered to the photograph. Eleanor's smile widened, and she pointed to herself, then to me, then made a gesture I interpreted as an invitation. The rest of the family was looking at me now too, their faces filled with what appeared to be genuine affection and interest. Over the following weeks, my relationship with the Morrison family deepened. I would come home each evening and spend hours talking to them about my day, my problems, my hopes for the future. They couldn't respond verbally, but their expressions conveyed understanding, sympathy, encouragement. Eleanor became especially responsive, often clapping her hands when I shared good news or offering comforting gestures when I was feeling down. The family began to move more freely within the confines of the frame. The parents would lean toward each other during intimate conversations. The boys would nudge each other and grin when I told funny stories. And Eleanor would often move to the front of the group, pressing her small hands against what appeared to be the glass surface of the photograph. I started bringing the photograph with me to different rooms, propping it up on my bedside table at night so the Morrison family could keep me company. While I slept, I would wake up sometimes to find them in different positions, as if they'd been moving around during the night, living their own lives within the silver frame. My coworkers began commenting on my improved mood, my increased confidence. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I was part of something bigger than myself. The Morrison family had become my family, and their constant presence filled the emotional void that had been consuming me since the divorce. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice that the family's expressions were changing again. The parents looked concerned, almost worried. The boys appeared restless, often glancing toward the edges of the frame as if looking for something beyond their confined space. And Eleanor, little Eleanor, who had become my closest companion, began to look sad, sometimes pressing both hands against the glass with an expression of desperate longing. It was on a Friday night, during another of our endless storms, that I finally understood what they wanted. I was sitting in my chair, sharing the details of my day with the Morrison family, when Eleanor began making frantic gestures. She pointed to herself, then to me, then to the space around her within the photograph. Her mouth moved urgently, and, while I couldn't hear her voice, I could read her lips. "Help us. Please help us. What's wrong?" I asked aloud, leaning closer to the frame. The entire family was agitated now. The father was pointing toward the edge of the frame. The mother was reaching out toward me, and the boys were making what appeared to be urgent gestures. Eleanor's expression was desperate, almost panicked. "We're trapped," I read on her lips. "We've been trapped so long. Please." That's when I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. Behind the family, the formal living room setting was beginning to fade. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture was becoming shabby and worn, and shadows were creeping in from the edges of the photograph. Whatever world they existed in was deteriorating, and they were running out of time. "How can I help you?" I whispered. Eleanor smiled through her tears and mouthed a single word: "Switch." I understood immediately. They wanted me to trade places with them, to free them from their prison while taking their place in the photograph. It was the same choice I'd been hearing about in whispered stories around town, the same terrible bargain that had claimed others who found cursed objects during these endless rainy nights. But looking at their desperate faces, at Eleanor's pleading eyes, at this family who had become more real to me than anyone in my actual life, I felt my resistance crumbling. They had given me companionship when I was alone, comfort when I was in pain, love when I felt unlovable. How could I abandon them now? What would happen to me? I asked. "You'll be with us forever." Eleanor mouthed back, "We'll be a real family, all of us together." I looked around my empty house, thought about my solitary existence, my failed marriage, my inability to connect with people in the real world. Then I looked at the Morrison family, at the love and acceptance in their faces, at the promise of belonging that had always eluded me. The choice seemed obvious. I picked up the photograph and held it close to my face. "What do I need to do?" Eleanor's expression brightened, and she gestured for me to press my hand against the glass surface of the frame. As I did, I felt a strange tingling sensation, as if electricity were passing between us. "Now close your eyes and wish to be with us," she mouthed. I closed my eyes and made the wish with every fiber of my being. I felt a pulling sensation, as if I were being drawn forward, and suddenly I was falling through space and time, through layers of reality I'd never imagined existed. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the Morrison family's living room, but it wasn't the pristine 1940s setting I'd expected. The wallpaper was faded and peeling. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, and everything had the gray, lifeless quality of a place that had been abandoned for decades. The family was there, but they weren't the warm, loving people I'd come to know. They were translucent, flickering like old film, their expressions cold and predatory. Eleanor, sweet little Eleanor, smiled at me with teeth that seemed too sharp, eyes that held no warmth at all. "Thank you," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the decaying room. "We've been waiting so long for someone to take our place, but I thought we would be together. You said we'd be a family." The father laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "We said you'd be with us forever. We never said we'd stay." I spun around, looking for an exit, but the room had no doors, no windows, just fading walls that seemed to stretch into infinity. I was trapped in this deteriorating photograph. Wow. They were free to leave, to live in the real world using the connection I'd foolishly provided. "Don't worry," The mother said, her voice growing fainter as the family began to fade. Others will come eventually. They always do. Lonely people looking for connection, for family, for love. And when they do, you can make them the same offer we made you. No, I whispered, but they were already gone, leaving me alone in the crumbling remains of their artificial world. That was 8 months ago. I exist now as a photograph, trapped in that silver frame, forced to watch the world through glass while the Morrison family lives my life in the real world. They're doing well, from what I can observe. They've made friends, gotten involved in community activities, even started dating people. No one suspects that the man they see isn't really me, but something wearing my face, something that learned to mimic human behavior during decades of observation. The photograph has been sold again. Apparently my body, controlled by whatever the Morrison family has become, decided it was too creepy to keep around. I'm back in an antique shop now, waiting on a dusty shelf for the next lonely soul to discover me. When they do, I'll try to be different. I'll try to resist the temptation to offer them the same false comfort that was offered to me. But I know what it's like to be alone, to be desperate for connection, to want so badly to belong somewhere that you'll believe any promise of love and acceptance. And I know that when I see that desperation in someone's eyes, when I recognize that familiar ache for companionship, I'll probably make them the same offer that was made to me. Because misery loves company, and eternity is a very long time to spend alone. The rain is falling again tonight, drumming against the shop's windows, and I can sense someone approaching, someone lonely, someone searching, someone ready to believe that a family in an old photograph might be the answer to all their problems. I can already feel myself preparing the performance, arranging my expression to look warm and welcoming, getting ready to offer the comfort and connection that only the truly desperate would believe could come from a 70-year-old picture. After all, we all need family, even if we have to trap others to get it. Closing these 3 stories have haunted me for years now, ever since I learned the truth about the objects we bring into our homes, the comfort we seek in our loneliness, and the prices we're willing to pay for connection. The music box still plays its wall somewhere, seeking dancers for its eternal performance. The mirror still shows perfect reflections to those who doubt themselves, and the photograph still offers family to anyone desperate enough to believe in its promise. I've shared these experiences with you tonight because I've learned something important about the horror that hides in plain sight. It doesn't come looking for us. We invite it in. We bring it home. We make the choice to trust objects that promise to fill the empty spaces in our lives. The rain is still falling as I finish this account, and I can't help but wonder what other cursed objects are sitting in antique shops and estate sales right now, waiting for the next lonely soul to discover them. What other promises of comfort and companionship are being whispered to people who have forgotten how to connect with the living world? If you've listened to these stories and felt that familiar ache of recognition, if you've seen yourself in the choices these men made, I want you to remember something. The loneliness you feel is real, but it's not permanent. The emptiness in your life can be filled, but not by objects that promise easy answers to complex problems. The next time you're tempted by something that seems too good to be true, the next time you find yourself drawn to an object that promises to change your life, remember these stories. Remember that some gifts come with prices that can never be paid in full. This has been Dr. Bonechil, and I hope you'll stay with us on this journey into the darkness that surrounds us every day. If these stories have moved you, if they made you question the things you surround yourself with, please like this video and subscribe to help us reach more people who need to hear these warnings. Share your own experiences in the comments, because I have a feeling these 3 objects aren't the only cursed items out there waiting to prey on human loneliness. Remember, we're never truly alone, but sometimes that's the most terrifying truth of all. Until next time, keep your doors locked, your curtains drawn, and be very careful what you bring home on rainy nights. The darkness is always watching, and it's always hungry for company.